everybody just to move up as far as you can. Ignore seat numbers, ignore protocol. Just, if you can come up to the front so that we're actually closer together while we're speaking. And then just before we officially start the program, because we are in Botswana, because we are in Africa, we actually want to start with a little African ritual. And so I'm going to hand over to the next generation, Sechaba, who will explain and then just lead us all. So if you could all follow his lead, join us in being grounded where we are this morning as we start our dialogue. Thank you.
All right, everyone. So the first thing that we need to do is actually stand. So what I'm going to do is a very simple exercise. We did it yesterday at the Q&A, and it comes from the Bushman, Khoisan, and trance dance. So the idea is that it's kind of like the equivalent of mindfulness meditation, except that it's something that's drawn from the indigenous hunter-gatherers from this area. So it's a very, very simple thing. All we're going to do is clap, okay? But I don't know much about music, but there's something in music called phase shifting. So there's going to be a general clap, and then others who feel compelled, you just sort of have to listen to the spirit, who feel compelled to sort of clap slightly out of rhythm, you do that, okay? Maybe some of you will just clap out of rhythm because you... But you'll see that the phase shifting kind of gives a kind of an aesthetic quality to the clapping. All right, so it's very simple. You just follow me. So the phase shifting. So everyone just keep doing it like this. The phase shifting, others could do this.
Thank you, Sechaba. So, this morning, first of all, welcome to all of you that are here. Welcome to day 2 of this dialogue on spirituality, science, and humanity, Butu Ubuntu. I'd like to welcome also all of those people who joined us yesterday during the live stream and are with us now, and especially those people who are so far away that they are staying up late at night or waking up very, very early in the morning to join us. We've got a really riveting day today. Yesterday, we did quite a lot of the thinking and speaking about the spirituality and humanity elements of Butu Ubuntu. Today, we're going to start off with some of the science. We have 3 really amazing presentations on different aspects of this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time telling you what they're going to do, because I actually think it's much better for them to tell you themselves. And just to say about the format, we're going to have a presentation and then a discussion on stage in response to that presentation. We'll then have the second presentation and a discussion on stage about that presentation. And then we will open it up to the audience to actually join in and bring your own questions, comments, etc. So while you're sitting and listening, if you've got burning questions, write them down, prepare yourself. I will ask all of you to keep comments and questions short. There are a lot of us here, and if everybody is to be able to take part, and if we're all going to be able to interact, we actually try and need to keep ourselves concise. So as we start, can I just remind you, I'm not going to tell you what they do. You have a program, so you can follow the program. But welcome Lily, Uri, Tupten, Mandaza, Karsten, Michael, Becca. Thank you very much. So we're starting this morning with Becca, formerly Dr. Rebecca Shansky.
I'm still that person.
And Becca's going to actually lead us off this morning about the impact of trauma on the brain, structural changes and behavioral outcomes. Becca, I'm handing over.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, thank you so much. It is an absolute honor to be here, and I'm so excited to share with you today just a tiny sliver of how neuroscientists are working in the laboratory to help us understand the brain and how that can then be translated into helping people. So yesterday during Michael's talk, he said something that really resonated with me and with the kinds of things I think about from my work. And he said, every encounter is a recreation of the self. And he told stories about how he visited leper colonies and how that changed the way he saw the people who were living there. And I think that's something that's true in a very, very broad sense, is that every experience we have shapes who you are. And sometimes the experiences you have can change you just a little bit, and sometimes they can have a really, really big impact on how you live your life and how you see the world. And so you can imagine probably an experience that you personally have had, whether it was visiting a new country or a traumatic event, but something really, and you can feel the change inside you. And that's what I study in my lab, is how that happens inside your brain. And so the term we use for this, which some of you may have heard before, is called neuroplasticity. And so the brain, even though you might not feel it, is constantly changing shape. And this is adaptive. This is something that has to happen in order for us to go through life, in order for us to learn new things, learn about our environment. And some of these changes happen on such a small level that you can only really see them under a microscope. And that's what I study in my lab. And what you're looking at here on the right is a picture of 3 brain cells. So we study this neuroplasticity, essentially 1 brain cell at a time. And so these 3 brain cells that you're looking at, the reason you can see them is that my student took essentially a very, very tiny needle and injected each neuron individually with a fluorescent dye. And this is a technique that I learned when I was a trainee, and I passed it on to her, and now she is even better at it than I was, which is how it should be in science. And so the reason that we do this is that we want to understand these structural changes that occur in the brain when you have any kind of experience, whether it's good or bad. And what you can see in these 3 brain cells is they've got sort of a center body, and then they're reaching out all these branches, and these branches are there to receive information from other brain cells. And so and these are the things that actually structurally change all the time. Right now, you're listening to me. If you remember anything I say today, it's because of structural changes in your brain. And so what we look at is we look at these neurons under a microscope, and we see how do experiences cause changes in these branches. And you can imagine that if the job of these branches is to receive information that the way they change could change the ability of the brain cells to actually communicate with other brain cells. And so I'm going to show you another more dynamic picture. So these brain cells are three-dimensional. And what we like to do is to pull out all the structural information from them. Now, this is just one brain cell. You have about 100 billion of these in your brain. And you can imagine that with all of these branches, and if you zoom in even further, so this is an even higher microscopic image of just one of those little branches, you can see now they have all these little protrusions. And on the right, that's an actual photograph, or sorry, on the left, that's an actual photograph that was taken on a microscope. And on the right is essentially a computer analysis program that allows us to measure everything there is to measure about these branches. And so with each of these little protrusions that you can see, they each are capable of forming at least one connection with other neurons, if not more. And so when you do all the math, you end up with about 100 trillion connections within the brain. And that's why your brains are so amazing and you're capable of doing so many complex things, is that there are so many connections between all different parts of your brain. So what I want to do now is back up. So now this is the level of the cell. What do brains look like? And I'm going to show you a whole bunch of brains. So what you can see here is we're looking at the brains of a number of different species. So in the top left, you can see that's what a human brain looks like. To the right is an elephant brain, which I think is way more impressive than a human brain. But then as we move back down through the sort of evolutionary tree here, you can see that they not only get smaller, but less complicated looking, right? So you can see that the human and the elephant brain have lots and lots of different folds in them, and then the other primates and the cat, and I know you can't really see the rodent, but I'll zoom in on that in a second. So that's a rodent brain. And so you can see the rodent brain is very smooth, human brain very convoluted and folded. And what you're looking at in both of these cases is a part of the brain called the cortex. And the cortex developed these folds over evolution to basically give us more surface area, to give us more neurons in a smaller space. So if you can imagine, if somebody handed you a tapestry and said, you have to carry this on your head, you're not going to carry it all opened up and spread out, right? That would be really hard to get through life. You would fold it up, make it nice and compact. And that's exactly what evolution has given us, so that we can carry around a lot of cortex in a very small amount of space. Now, despite the size differences and the differences in cortical folds, we can actually learn a lot from the rodent brain. And what I'm going to tell you about today are two specific parts of the brain that I'm very interested in and that are really important for understanding the impact of trauma. So here now what we've done, this is a drawing of a human brain. We've basically taken the two hemispheres and crack them open. And so now you're looking at sort of the middle of the brain. And the areas of the brain that I care about are called the prefrontal cortex, and that's illustrated there in purple, and the amygdala, which is that little orange nut shape there at the bottom. And so the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala are critical for emotion regulation. So the amygdala is one of the oldest evolutionarily structures that we have. And so the amygdala essentially will activate an emotional response. This is especially important for fearful responses, for negative experiences. And when you look at people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, if you look at the activity in their amygdala, it is very often overactive. In contrast, the prefrontal cortex can regulate the amygdala activity. So the prefrontal cortex is there to sort of say, okay, we've got all this information here. Is this a situation that I need to be, in which I need to be afraid, or can I kind of tamp down my response and go through my day? And when you look at people with PTSD, again, and you look at their prefrontal cortex activity, it seems to be kind of underactive. And so together, if we have an overactive part of the brain that is responsible for eliciting a fear response and an underactive part of the brain that's responsible for controlling or regulating that response, you can imagine that that's when you start to get some of the symptoms of PTSD, these emotions that come out even when you're not in a life-threatening situation. And that's what can be disruptive to people's lives. And so the symptoms of PTSD in general may reflect a disruption of this connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And so in my lab, we look at, again, rodents. And part of the reason this is something that we can do, you might think I'm very, very different from a rat, and I assure you, you are. But your amygdalas actually are kind of similar. And so what you're looking at here is a picture of a cross-section of a human brain and a cross-section of a rat brain. And the rat brain is, of course, blown up. It's really much smaller. But what those yellow circles are showing you is the location of the amygdala in both the human brain and the rodent brain. And you can see that proportionally, they're essentially in the same place, and they take up about the same amount of proportional space. Whereas you can see on the left, you've got all those cortical folds in the human brain, and there's a very smooth cortex in the rodent brain. So that's where we're different. The amygdalas are very similar. And because the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala make the same connections in the human brain, okay. The human brain and the rodent brain, we can, as scientists, ask the rats to help us understand our own brains. We can study these connections, and we can study what happens to these connections when an individual undergoes a traumatic event. So what is known so far about neuroplasticity in response to stress? So neuroscientists have been studying this in animal models for a couple of decades now. And what we see in the prefrontal cortex is that an animal exposed to stress loses some of those branches in response to stress. And so this means that it may not be able to form some of the connections that it needs to. So these neurons shrink, and the synapses become rigid, which means they become less plastic. So you can imagine that if your neuroplasticity is compromised, then moving forward in life, you're not able to adapt and learn as much as you would normally. In contrast, what we see in the amygdala is that these neurons expand when an animal is exposed to stress. And so we now have this imbalance where the prefrontal cortex becomes compromised, the amygdala is essentially strengthened, and that is a relationship that essentially favors basic survival over social nuances, right? And so for maybe a rodent in the wild, that's a useful kind of adaptation. But for people, when we lose the ability of the prefrontal cortex to regulate our emotion, that can become problematic. Now, one of the caveats I have to tell you about this is that almost all of these studies were conducted in male animals only. And that's sort of a problem, because actually if we're trying to understand mental illnesses that are caused by stress, it's not really very valid, because more women will develop PTSD after a trauma than men will. And so you might be wondering why that would be, that scientists would only study male animals. And it comes from a misunderstanding about variability due to different things. So just like women, female rats have a hormonal cycle. And so some days the hormones of estrogen are high, some days they're low, and scientists think, oh my God, that's going to destroy my data. I can't control this. I can't possibly know anything about the brain if I'm studying a female animal. So I'm here to tell you that male animals also show variability in their experimental outcomes. It just isn't due to hormones necessarily. And sometimes, the differences that we see between males and females have nothing to do with hormones. There are differences in male and female brains that arose right from birth. And so this is a big issue that is slowly starting to change in neuroscience research. People are beginning to understand that if we want to apply our findings to humans, that we can't only study half of them. And so in my lab, one of my big research questions is, do males and females have different ways of adapting to stress? So can we simply use the same measures in males and females, or do we have to use kind of a different lens? And so one of the things we do in my lab, besides studying neuroplasticity, is to actually look at behavioral responses to stress and being able to combine behavioral outcomes with cellular measures is what I think is going to eventually lead us to be able to develop more personalized treatments for trauma victims. We need to understand what are the individual differences that define the outcomes that we see. And so in my lab, behaviorally, one of the things we study is fear. And we can essentially train an animal to be afraid of a noise. And for the last 40, 50 years, the way that you decide whether or not an animal is afraid, or at least a rat, is by how much time it spends not moving at all. And we call this freezing because you can see what's going on in this picture. The animal is essentially frozen. He's not cold, he's just not moving at all. And so it's sort of a measure that either the animal is doing this freezing behavior or it's not. And I became very interested in the not side of things when one of my students said, I am watching these videos of an animal and this animal looks afraid, right? She's sort of darting around the cage, but if we were only measuring freezing, this animal would get a very low score, and we would say, well, she's not very afraid. But we thought that this looked like the animal was afraid, and so we started to measure that, and it turned out we only saw it in female animals. So here is a whole new behavior that has not been categorized before and has basically been ignored because scientists aren't studying female animals. So this is something we're really excited about, trying to define and understand why females would do this and males would not. Because one of the later outcomes we saw in the animals that used this behavior was that they had better cognitive flexibility and lower fear later on. So if you have a traumatic event, that happens to you, what you want to be able to do is to be able to essentially bounce back, right? You want to be resilient. You want to be able to say, okay, that happened, but I can put it behind me and move on and continue on with a successful life. And this is essentially what we saw in the subgroup of female animals that use this behavior. And so now we're trying to understand what are the mechanisms, the brain, the neurobiology that underlies this behavior? Because if we can essentially harness that, we might be able to develop new ways to either treat or predict mental illness and resilience. Okay, so finally, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some research. It's not my research, but I think it's really relevant to our conversation here. And we're going to ask the question, do rats practice Ubuntu? And so, of course, I don't mean that as a conscious ethic that the rats are saying, oh, I should be, compassionate. But the question is, do rats understand when other rats are in distress? And that is one thing that, that we can observe in the laboratory. And so one kind of experiment that we have is called vicarious social defeat stress. And essentially, what you can see is going on here is the rat on the left is watching his friend be beat up by another rat. And so then as researchers, we can say, okay, how does that affect the rat on the left? What is it like to witness cruelty in a friend? And so what we see in these animals is that when an animal witnesses social defeat, that animal develops what we call depressive-like symptoms. And so just witnessing these kind of events can have long-lasting effects on a person. You don't have to personally be the victim. And so this is really relevant to understanding the impact or the effects of living in environments with, for example, dangerous social hierarchies, for children who might have a school bully, those kinds of things. So understanding the neurobiology of how watching these things happened, I think is going to be really important for understanding what we're doing. That's just the reference. In a more positive note, there is another set of studies that look to see whether animals will help each other. And so in this case, we can see that rats might express empathy. If there is a rat who is trapped in this plastic tube, another rat will learn to press a lever and release that rat. And so this is something that, that seems to depend on understanding that the animal is distressed. There have been a little bit of controversy because some people say, oh, maybe they just want to be closer to their friend. But there's been some experiments to prove that it's not just about their own personal social rewards. Now, what is really interesting, one interesting caveat about this research is that these animals will only help the animal that's trapped if they have lived with them previously. And so this is very interesting because it gives us a sense of how essentially in-group and out-groups can be formed. And so I'm going to take you through this experiment a little bit because I think it's really cool. So here we have two different kinds of rats. One is called an albino rat, and one is called a hooded rat. And so normally, if the hooded rat saw another hooded rat trapped in the tube, he says, oh, that's my friend, I'm going to go let him out. And if it saw an albino rat, it would be like, no, I don't really care about you very much. However, if you take a baby hooded rat and you basically let it be adopted by an albino rat and it nurses with albino rat babies, grows up with the albino rats, now that hooded rat feels as if it's part of the albino rat in-group. And so now if you do that same experiment, the hooded rat sees another hooded rat, not interested in helping that hooded rat, but will help the albino rat. So what I think this shows is that there is at least some learning component to developing empathy. And there is at least on some level a very basic drive to help rats in distress. And this also shows that in-groups formation appear to have some basic roots. They may be adaptive, right? So it feels good to be part of a group, and I think we're going to hear more about that from Karsten. So finally, some of the major questions we're interested in. So it seems that forming in-groups is a learned activity. It's not innate. You don't recognize what part of a group you are from the very beginning. These are things that are learned. And so if they're learned, there must be some kind of structural plasticity involved, but we don't know where that's happening in the brain, and we don't know what any of the biological mechanisms are that create that. And of course, from my personal interest, I would be interested to know if these processes are different in males and females, and then what are the clinical implications of this? So if we know that empathy, that the biological basis of empathy is different in males and females, how can we use that to approach some of the questions that we've been talking about here? Okay, so that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Becca. I don't know about that being all you had. That was a lot. I'm trying to get past the male-female experiments. I'm finding it very difficult. The whole world could be different. We could invest differently.
Very true.
But we will go on. So I'm going to turn to our group of presenters for you to have your responses and comments and questions for Becca. Questions? Start with Lily, and then guys, jump on in.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Becca. That was so good because I could actually follow. I'm impressed with myself.
Good.
But really, the glory goes to you because you've been able to bring it down to our level of understanding and also making the connections with Ubuntu. I think that's important. Well, my question really is whether there are cross-cultural studies of rats. Cross-cultural in the sense that, okay, you have European studies, you also have African studies of rats, and I'm talking as a novice and a terrible layman. Because I was thinking there, because you're talking about the amygdala and so on and so forth, so I was wondering whether, initially I was thinking about humans, and whether there are studies of Africans, because we've gone through colonialism and all kinds of oppression. And so I was wondering whether the way in which we would be found to have responded, looking at our amygdala, may have some, may actually point towards some understanding of whether the resilience that I actually made mention of yesterday has been there and what's indicated in the amygdala about that. So I was wondering, because now you obviously perhaps haven't studied us in that respect, that maybe there could be studies of rats within our context that might reflect something of what we have experienced, which can then be a pointer for further studies of humans here. Purely layman kind of question.
Yeah, so that is a great question. And there are not necessarily cultural studies of rats, but we do study different kinds of rodents and rodents that may be predisposed to certain things. So there are animals who genetically are, sort of express a depression-like phenotype. They're just on a different level than your standard albino rat or hooded rat. And we actually did a study in my lab that just came out looking at albino rats versus hooded rats and male versus females in essentially a stress coping test, and we found basically big sex differences in the albino rats, and we didn't see as many sex differences in the hooded rats. And when we looked at we didn't look at the amygdala, we looked at the prefrontal cortex. It seemed to relate to how much of the prefrontal cortex was activated when the animal was stressed. So the more the prefrontal cortex was activated, the more of, or I would say the less of a depressive response we saw. So the prefrontal cortex really seems to be important for regulating emotion, for keeping you resilient and active. It's really about kind of regulating the amygdala. So if you can keep the amygdala under control, then I think you're more likely to have a better outcome.
Okay, so Michael and then Jimpa.
Yeah. I liked this presentation very well. Thank you. I mean, if in-group behaviors are learned, is there a possibility that they can also be unlearned? I mean, to have a dissociation without having a kind of subjective trauma to the subject that is unlearning the in-group behavior. Is it possible to reverse it?
So it's the idea of reversing something you've learned is tricky. So what you can do is not necessarily completely erase the memory, right? So if you grow up with a certain in-group, you have those experiences, and as you would imagine, those experiences shape who you are. You can't completely unravel the entire tapestry. But what you can do is add to the tapestry and create new memories and new associations that might be able to essentially override the original thing.
Jim.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful, beautiful, and clear. I'm very intrigued by your comment about the fact that the perception, the formation of in-group is a learned trait. And you have compellingly shown that to be the case in the story of the two types of rats. So my question has to do with the sort of the critical time period. So in the case of the rats, does it have to be right from the beginning that the hooded rat is brought up along with albino rats? And if that is the case, and that is one question, and if that is the case, if we were to extrapolate from this and apply it to the human species, what would be the critical period? And the second thing is that this kind of formation of in-group, given that in the case of rat, it's a hooded versus albino, it seems to be primarily based on a visual perception of how I look like. So this seems to have some connections with the race, colors, and so on. So I'm wondering whether this in-group perception to extend across, races is a more difficult challenge. So if you have any, I'm just thinking aloud.
Yeah.
But the basic idea that in-group formation is a learned trait I think has a profound implication if we can somehow understand how it works in humans.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to take a couple of different points of that. So, first of all, the critical period for brain development, especially development of the prefrontal cortex, is essentially the same in rodents and humans, which is that it is really critical through adolescence and sort of like very early adulthood. So that's when the prefrontal cortex is still developing, still forming all those connections with other parts of the brain that are mostly in place from birth. The prefrontal cortex is like the last thing to come online. That's why, you say teenagers are impulsive and they can't regulate their emotions very well. It's because their prefrontal cortex isn't done developing yet. And so we see the same thing in rodents. It got to get all the way through puberty before the prefrontal cortex is fully connected. So given that developmental time period is the easiest time to make an impact, but that's not to say that we can't change behaviors during adulthood. It's just probably going to be a different neurobiological mechanism for doing so, and that I think is going to be a really important area of study for neuroscientists. The second point about what the animals look like, actually rats have terrible eyesight. So there are probably some, and they look different because of their genes, but there are probably olfactory cues that they're tuning into more so, and possibly,
olfactory?
Sorry? Olfactory is how you smell. Sorry. So the animals are probably recognizing some odors on the rats that they grew up with that are really what's cueing them in to say, okay, this is an in-group type thing.
Okay, so Mandaza and then Carsten.
I love the talk on recreation of the self in your presentation scientifically. Recreation of the self. What healing do you see there that can be connected with Ubuntu? In African culture and wisdom, you must be promoting some kind of healing here when you are creating the self. It's a sign of that Ubuntu again, the center point, isn't it? There is also an issue that I wanted you to explain further. It's a beautiful thing. The brain and our environment. That connection is powerful for me.
Yes.
How do we connect this so that they work in peace and harmony? What is science doing about that? You also raised the point of do rats practice Ubuntu? You cannot see how the rats practice Ubuntu if you put them in cages. I would encourage you to visit the community of the rats in nature. Yeah. Because if you put that rat in the cage, it changes its behavior. It's in prison. And the last question is, what do you do with the rest that you capture and do your studies? Do you, at the end of the day, release them into nature?
Okay. So these are all really, really important questions. So I want to clarify that the rats that we use, we don't capture them from the wild. They're born in the laboratory, and they are they exist as to be sort of genetically identical as possible, so that we can limit some of the variability that we might see in rats that are from the wild. So these rats, do have a limited life experience compared to animals that are in the wild, and so that's an important caveat for neuroscience research. And so, so there are scientists who study groups of rats. They live in big communities, and they can watch them interact with each other, and they can watch them form social hierarchies. And so that is probably a better example of whether or not we can see these things. One of the things that scientists want to do in order to draw conclusions from our experiments is to essentially isolate one aspect of what we're studying at a time. And so that's why in the experiment I told you about, it was essentially a, kind of a very focused experiment that just says, if there's a rat that's in distress, what will another rat do, without any other distractions or things that might influence the data, the outcome of our experiment. So that's the reasoning for doing that kind of experiment, as opposed to observing animals in the wild. But there are scientists who do those things too.
So, Carsten, I'm going to come to you, but in the meantime, Mandaza and Jhumpa, I'd really like you to think about, I'm throwing the question that you asked Becca back to you, about if the science is showing that there's something about our prefrontal cortex and its elasticity, its ability to adapt and change, what would be your understanding of the linkage between the spirit and the ecology that we live under as humans that links to that idea of elasticity? How do we stimulate that elasticity, stimulate the connections, as it were, and depress the fear syndrome bit? So I'm going to ask you to think about that while I go to Carsten.
Thank you. So one of the questions that you raised at the end, if in-groups are learned, what is the neuroplasticity underlying it? Prompted in me another question that is perhaps needs to be answered before that, and perhaps we already have the answer, except I don't know, so I'm curious. So the question here is, if we see these rats make a discriminatory decision, I help the in-group and I do not help the other, the non-in-group. And you've talked about the amygdala, you've talked about the prefrontal cortex. Let's briefly say an impulsive, immediate, intuitive response versus a more controlled, thoughtful response. Is there any evidence, as far as you know, from voles, rats, or even humans, that this in-group, out-group discriminatory decision is a learned response that you have shown? But is it also learned and modulated by the amygdala, this very basic aspect, a very intuitive, almost automatic? Or is it a more controlled top-down? So the initial reaction is, I help everybody. Oh no, wait a minute. This is in-group, this is out-group. That would be a top-down, controlled discriminatory. Or is it like, I help them, and I don't even think about them? Can you say anything about that?
So I don't think those specific experiments have been done yet to really tease apart the neural circuitry and what the timing is. Like you say, is this something that the animal actually deliberates about and makes a conscious choice about whether or not it is worth the risk, right? So any animal that is, possibly going to expose itself to another animal, there might be a life-threatening risk in there. So I don't think those experiments have been done yet. The only one I know that has looked at potential neurobiology of it is that if you give the rat an antidepressant, it won't release the rat no matter what group it's from.
If you give them an antidepressant.
If you give them an antidepressant. So the idea is that there has to be some experiencing, some sort of transitive experiencing of the distress that the trapped animal is in. And if the animal on the outside is like, I feel great, then they're not processing or they're not responding to that distress in the same way they would if they were, drug-free.
But the antidepressant dampens the amygdala more than the prefrontal cortex. So would that not suggest that it is the amygdala that drives this type?
That drives the response. It's possible.
I mean, it's speculative, I understand, but
it's possible.
Okay, thank you.
So, and that takes us right back then to this question of what might we be able to do about dampening the amygdala reaction and stimulating the prefrontal cortex elasticity. I am not a scientist, guys. So
I think, science will tell us that amygdala does more than just elicit the fear response.
Yeah,
it's got a lot more complicated role. My own sense is, and this is of course coming from the Buddhist wisdom tradition, that in the Buddhist text, or from the Buddhist perspective, we speak of wisdom aspect and then the more kind of intention, emotion-based aspect. Mm-hmm. And so the certain types of strategies would involve opening your heart. It's not a cognitive strategy, which is a top-down approach, but more of an opening your heart, feeling a connection with others. So kind of trying to be at a very fundamental human level so that you learn to really recognize everybody as the same. And this involves getting in touch with other people's vulnerability, just as your own vulnerability. And we know from our own personal experience that when a total stranger is struck down by a car and is bleeding, we don't stop to ask, is he from my own community? Does he speak my language? Is he Buddhist? We don't ask any of that. We just immediately feel the connection because pain, particularly an acute pain, is such a powerful connector. Mm. And there, I would argue that response is coming more from the basic emotion, amygdala response of being able to connect. Mm. So that's one strategy which involves, and this is where the Buddhist compassion meditation and those kind of empathy practices are really aimed at opening up the heart. The other approach is a top-down approach, which is more from the cognitive approach, which would involve consciously thinking about others, consciously imagining others, putting yourself in others' shoes, and consciously thinking that just as I wish to be happy, this person in front of me also wish to be happy. You don't have to like the person, but you can at least make the understanding that this person in front of me is just human like me. Yes. So that is a top-down approach. So I think there might be approaches coming from both, and the ideal scenario is the combination of both. But in some cases, for some people, the more heart-based approach is more powerful because people are very different and the temperaments are different. For some, the more cognitive, wisdom-based approach, I think the Buddhist tradition does have these techniques which at least recognizes two qualitatively different strategies.
Thank you. That's really
Does that make sense?
Yes, no, it
Rebecca,
does.
yeah.
Becca.
Oh, yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And I think, like when you just said people are very different, I think the balance of that heart and head approach and what your initial response is to seeing someone in distress does vary from person to person. And I think if we can understand how we can possibly teach ourselves and engage our neuroplasticity in a way that leads to more positive outcomes and more empathy and more, more helping, that's sort of a way forward, a way to use what we know about how the brain works to really change ourselves.
So, Mandaza, do you have anything to add to that? And then I'll come to you, Uri.
Actually, it's a related point, so maybe it will be...
Go ahead, yeah.
There is studies from Tanya Zinger in Germany that she saw that sometimes when you see someone else suffer and you want to be compassionate, it's better not to feel their pain, but actually to act on it. So, for example, if I see my kid fall and start crying, it's better that I won't start crying and feel the pain, but actually run and help him, right? So she saw that other part of the frontal cortex, and not the amygdala, mainly the orbital cortex, which is slightly below the middle prefrontal cortex, is activating this compassion moment and help you to balance it out. And she saw that some people tend to react and really mirroring the pain, and some group, like doctors or nurses, are actually more prone to suppress the pain, but activate compassion and go and help them.
Thank you, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Mandaza.
Yeah, I'm still being struck by this thing, recreation of the self. And in religion or spiritual terms, we talk of transformation, change for the better. In their study, we want them to really go deeper into that and bring this connection together. It must be lively, not just like a form of study. Bring that very strongly to the attention of the people. It's very important. Creation and self, it's very important, Mama. And there is this issue, the brain, human brain, and our environment. That means scientists are very connected with nature in one way or another, because all you study about is about nature. Everything you study about comes from nature. So what kind of environment should humanity put in place so that there is harmony and peace and the spirit of togetherness here? We need to emphasize that. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
And again, visiting natural nature is important. Because if you look at the rats in their natural environment, there is a lot of Ubuntu. During the rain season, they know where to store the food for the whole family. During the winter season, it's the same story. So there are these communities in nature that we need as scientists and spiritual people to visit and be with them. There is a lot of wisdom in nature, a lot of information that we are disregarding because we think the rat is a rat. It's not that simple to say a rat is a rat.
Oh, I know.
It's a relative to us, you know. So thank you for raising these points. Thank you, Mama. Yeah.
Are there such things as rat anthropologists?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
No, seriously, because that is in effect
to
what you're
Ubuntu,
talking about.
in our own African culture, don't capture an animal and keep it forever there. That relationship with that animal, with that bird, with that rat, you become enemies. because the rat has feelings. It speaks its own language. It has its own, way of life. We don't even know. So we must establish good relationship with everything around us. Even when you are doing your studies, scientific studies, create and establish that strong relationship with that one you are studying.
Okay, so we'll go to Lily. Just to say, though, about the relationships with the rats, I remember, Becca, you saying to Cliff during one of the conversations that one of the things that they try to do is to make sure that the rats don't actually suffer in the work that you do. But we can come back to that. Lily.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I think that's an indication of scientists acknowledging Ubuntu in their setting, not using rats in a manner that is un-Boto-like. So with that, I just want to go back to the point Mhondoro made. Because I think what it does is that it calls our attention to the fact that the scientists can't work alone in silos, that they actually need to interact more with people like Mhondoro. Because of the wisdom that they have, that can actually help them to do better what they do. And I also like the fact that actually what he's encouraging that scientists do actually points to the issue of cross-cultural studies of rats. And in fact, I think you already are beginning to do that. If you're already, some of the scientists are already studying rats in another type of environment, although perhaps not in the natural as it is given. So I think it also means that scholarship generally must put more emphasis on interdisciplinary work. In this case, as would be between neuroscientists and people who have other types of knowledge that should be brought to the table that can actually enhance what we know, can enhance our knowledge, and can actually result in the human flourishing. We're all, striving to and less suffering and better sustainability of what is given to us by nature.
And I think that actually this kind of dialogue is one of the steps in those things, because I'd really like to think that the scientific information that's been given will make those of us who are social scientists or spiritualists or naturalists actually think a little differently about what we're doing, even if it's in the analysis of it, and that the scientists will go away with additional questions, different questions, questions that they wouldn't have had before because of that interaction. So I'm going to change the subject just a tiny bit before we move on, because I'm really interested in the male-female rat difference. I can't actually tell whether I'm glad that they don't do as much with female rats, because then they get left alone. But it was actually what you were saying about resilience and the fear response, the difference between the freezing and the darting, and that women darted. And I was actually thinking about how in lots of situations of armed conflict that I've been involved with in the past, women can't freeze because they're looking after children, they're looking after communities, they're finding food. It's almost like constant motion. And I was wondering what that means about then resilience. So I just wanted to ask you just a little bit more about what you are finding about the darting and longer-term resilience as opposed to the freezing, and whether there's, the differences, basically.
Yeah, so I mean, what we have now is evidence that the females who, and we don't see this in every single female, and again, this is, why studying individual differences is so important, because there may be sort of signatures of resilience or vulnerability that you can observe when people are exposed to a trauma. And this is something that is studied clinically as well. There's evidence that people who are, if they undergo a trauma and then they report back, or not report back, but are, express, sort of talk through what they went through and how they felt in the moment. The people who experience the feelings of helplessness, who maybe did engage some sort of like freezing or passive behaviors while the event was happening, are more at risk later on of developing post-traumatic stress disorder than people who did have this active response. So there's a real parallel here between what we're seeing in these female rodents and what we know about the clinical signs that people might be at risk for PTSD who have been exposed to a trauma. So we're still trying to work out what darting means, but it does seem like in rodents, the females are, generally speaking, more active and do engage more active coping responses. And if I can tell a story about some research I learned about last week at a conference. So there is, if you have an animal that is trained to fear the tone, and you put its cage mate in the fearful environment with it, when the afraid animal hears the tone, it exhibits fearful behavior, and the friend will, if it's a male, try and comfort its friend by grooming and kind of snuggling with it. When the female is afraid, the other female instead looks all around, explores, tries to find out, what the source of the fearful thing is coming from. Oh. When the fearful tone turns off, then she goes and comforts the friend. So there's a real difference in just sort of strategies of how males and females deal with each other and deal with a potentially life-threatening response. And I was thinking about the stories you were telling yesterday about the women who really took care of the Ebola crisis and that sort of thing. So I don't know where the men were for that, but
wow, interesting.
But yeah, there seem to be some parallels that are really meaningful.
Wow, I'd love to explore those. Okay, so we actually only have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask us to bring this to a halt so that we have time to set Uri up and make those changes. So I'm going to do 2 things. The first of all, everyone, is can we all really give Becca a great hand clap? That was really great. That was really good. Thank you so much. It's brilliant. And then as we swap places, can I ask all of you in the audience just to stand up for a minute so that we're still awake, still awake, still awake. Okay. And we're going to do something while they're moving around there. In Ghana, we call this making rain, okay? So we start just with your fingers here, rub your fingers together, and this is the wind gathering across the Sahara. And behind the wind, we know is coming the clouds. And then, are there little pitter, 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 pitter patters of rain? And then, the wind blowing, 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 and then the lightning clap. Okay, and now you can all sit down. We move on. Okay. So, Uri, I hope this means that everyone's awake for you now. Okay, so again, I'm not going to introduce Uri formally. You all have your programs that you can look in. But just to say that Uri is actually going to talk to us about dynamic and embodied brain-to-brain coupling. It's really scary. Okay, so Uri, I'm just going to hand straight over to you.
Thanks. I'm very, very happy to be here. It's really an honor. And also I thank Becca for this wonderful introduction that really will help my talk. And now basically we're going to switch from talking about rats to talking about the human brain. So we're going up the hierarchy. You always tell your kids to choose their friends really carefully, because you know that their friends are going to determine who they're going to be themselves. And we really know that the people that we're going to meet are going to change who we are. But there are other school of thought that minimize the role of the others and really focus on the self. And to give you one example, and this example is important because this example is, you can think about this scholar as the father of Western philosophy. And this is René Descartes. And René Descartes was saying, I think, therefore I am. So basically, he was focusing on the self and thinking, I know what I'm thinking. And now I'm starting from this point of view, and now I need to understand who you are. Maybe you are all a dream in my mind, right? So this leads to a focus on the self, and now there is a problem how I'm going from myself to the outside. The Ubuntu philosophy, it's very different. It's a I am because we are. So the starting point, it's not the individual, it's not me. I'm determined by my connection to you. So in order to understand who I am, I need to understand how my brain and my mind is connected to other people. And this is giving a very different perspective about human being. And to give you a sense how important is this connection to other people, we're going to do the following exercise. I want you all now to think about things that you can do with trees, okay? And there are many things that you can do with trees. And while you think about all these things that you can do with this like wonderful tree in the world, think, from where did you learn it? How do you know all these things? So now let's do this practice. What can we do with trees, right? First, I can pick food of a tree, right? I can also make a floating devices, right? Like a boat. I can make fire and then cook food. I can build furniture, or I can have a paper, and even money come from trees, right? All these things that we can do with tree, and when I look on a tree, I immediately see all these possibilities of doing stuff. I didn't invent it. I learned it from other brains, from other people. And what we see is that the more complex the social structure, the more capable the species to do things with other stuff. So there's a learning process. You know, I'm smarter now, and I know that the Earth is not flat, not because I found it myself, because I learned it from other generations, and we have a mechanism to accumulate knowledge across generations. And the best mechanism that we have for that is language. And language is really interesting because I didn't invent English, neither did you. You learn it from the community of speakers. And to give you an example how the meaning is determined by the people you are connected to, let's do the following exercise. Let's try to define the meaning of the word game. And this is an example that came from Ludwig Wittgenstein. Okay? So what is the definition of the word game? Is it to play together? No, because sometimes there is games that you play against yourself. Is it related to the physics? No, because sometimes you can play with your mind. Is it to win? That's also not a good definition for the word game, because sometimes the notion of winning when you're playing against yourself is very tricky. Is it to follow the rules? No, because sometimes there are open-ended games, right, that have no particular rules to follow. Is it to survive? Another you all say, survival in games? What are you talking about, right? But actually in other cultures, other periods, survival was part of the definition of the word game. So from this you learn a few things. First you learn there is not like one definition for a word. There are many different ways to use a word, and there is a family resemblance. And different contexts will activate different part of the meaning of the word. And another thing you learn is that the meaning is determined by the community of users. And different cultures will use the exact same word in a very different way. So exactly now you can see how the definition of the terms we are using is determined by the community we are connected to. So now, if you go back to the idea that I am because we are, there are two aspects to it. One, I think there is the humanistic aspect. You know, I grew up in Jerusalem. I'm living in the US, and I'm speaking to you in Africa, right? How come that I, with my very different background, can now talk to your brains? And I can talk to your brains because we are all connected. We are all similar, right? So this is the humanistic aspect. This is why I can communicate with you. But there is also a dark part to this sentence. It's not all bright. I am because we are. Who is this we? Is it really all of us together? Or is it my group and not your group, right? So over here, the we get a very different meaning. You know, it's we, the speakers, and you, the audience, right? It us, the scientist. It us, the man, it us, the woman, it us in Africa and us in Europe. You can see that the we can also take a dark side. And there are really two forces over here, right? The we as humanistic and the we as my group. And you can see it going all around the world. I can communicate with any people with any opinion, as Michael Ezer was saying yesterday, right? I can talk with women, I can talk with Christians, I can talk across tribes, but I can also immediately split and create a boundary, an in-group, out-group. And we tend to cluster, and in different dynamics we can get this other we. I'm defining by making me different than you. So we have these two forces all the time operating. So in my talk, what I'm going to do, in the first part I'm going to tell you what we know about what's happening in the brain that allows all to be connected together. And in the second part, I'm going to talk what happens in our brains that make us separate from another being, okay? The other force. And at the end, I'm going to bring it together and see how we can synthesize these two forces that are always operating among us. Okay. So now, if we really want to understand how we communicate with other brains, with other minds, we have also to go to the brain. So that's what we do. And now we need to develop a theory that allows us to explain how one brain is connected to another brain and how one brain can be uncoupled from another brain. So one way to think about communication is as following. I have now brain patterns in my brains that are related to what I'm thinking about. And what I'm doing now, I'm sending like sound waves. And these sound waves are going to your brain, and I'm trying to transfer my brain patterns that are related to what I'm thinking to your brains. So in a way, you can think that we are coupled. There is a physical coupling between my brain and your brain. But it's not a physical coupling that I'm touching with my hands. I'm touching you with my sound waves. So we have like wireless communication, but we are physically coupled now. Okay? So how do we study communication? We have this like fMRI machine. We put your brains over there, so you're lying, and I can measure your brain responses while you're listening to people speaking or while you're speaking yourself. And we tend to really work in the wild, so we really like to use real-life natural stimuli. And one type of stimuli that are really working for us is storytelling, because humans like to tell stories across all cultures. So we take professional storytellers, and we use their stories in the scanner. And to get a feeling of our stimuli, I'm going to play you now 20 seconds of a story. The story is 10 minutes long. It was told by a very talented storyteller, Jim O'Grady. And now you're going to listen to 20 seconds of this, from the story from the middle.
So I'm banging out my story, and I know it's good. And then I start to make it better by adding an element of embellishment. Reporters call this making shit up. And they recommend against crossing that line. But I had just seen the line crossed between a high-powered dean and assault with a pastry. And I kind of liked it.
Okay, so now think that I scanned all your brains while you're listening to this story, okay? So now what I'm going to do? I'm going to do the following analysis. I'm going to take one listener while you listen to the story. And when you listen to the story, you can see I am looking on one brain area. This is the red circle. The activity is going up and down while this brain area processes the story. And now I'm going to take another listener and ask, how similar is the brain responses of this person to another person? So basically what I'm asking is, how similar is your responses? Are you all operating as a we, or are you going to have differences across you, right? So now you can see 5 listeners over there, and this is their responses in this brain area where they were listening, and this is the auditory cortex that processes the sound where they were listening to the story. And we usually start the study by having silence in the scanner. So this is before the story starts. If I'm looking on the brain responses, each one is responding in a very different way. You are all different. However, immediately as the story is starting,
so I'm banging out my
something
story,
amazing
and I know it's
happening.
good. And then I start to make it
Suddenly you see
better
that the responses are all become aligned, and all
by
of you
adding
going
an element
up
of
and down
embellishment.
in a very similar way.
Reporters call this making
So
shit
suddenly
up.
you respond in the same way. And now we have to look how similar is the responses across all people. So if we look in these 2 listeners, and we look in these auditory areas, this is where we looked before, you can see these 2 listeners really respond in a very similar way while they're listening to the story. If you go up to language areas, above, it's a very different profile of responses, but it's still similar across these 2 people. And when we go to high order areas, again, you can see that it's a different response now, but it's still very similar across these 2 people. So we see these similarities across many brain areas that process these stories together. And we call it neural entrainment. Basically, the ability of all of you now to respond together to my sound, basically you become entrained to my sound. And to explain to you what's neural entrainment, I will first explain what is a physical entrainment, and then we will go what is a social entrainment, because this is what we care about. Okay? So this is physical entrainment. Think about this like 5 metronomes as like 5 brains. And they're going to click, but they're going to click out of phase, right? This is like your brain during rest. And now I'm going to come and connect them all together by putting them on these like 2 cylinders. And now there is a very small frequency that's going through these cylinders to the wood and coupled all the metronome together and see what's happening. You see, now you all click together. And that's exactly what's happening. Also, when you clap together, you can see you started out of phase, and suddenly all your brains went together, and you start clapping together. This is exactly this entrainment that's going from the outside. And now, once we couple these metronomes together, and I couple your brains, now I can speak with you, and I can start influence you. And this influence is starting at a very early age. Okay? So now I'm going to show you a clip between my son when he was really young, now he's 9, and my wife, who is sitting in the audience, and see how they developed a game only for the joy of being coupling to another brain. And you will also see that it's not clear who is leading the coupling. You can see both of them want to be coupled, and they manage to find a way to be coupled. Okay. So now when you start to be coupled with another brain, that's the moment that you can start to transfer information. And what you do with your kids, you start to learn them the meaning of single words. And then how to say sentences, and then don't behave that, this is the uncle, this is the food, and so forth. So you need this coupling in order to transfer knowledge across brains. And now when we go back to the adults, we can ask, so what's driving this coupling in each brain area? And basically what we see is that each brain area is coupled to another type of information. And we do the following experiment. First, we take this story that you listened, and we can play it backward. Now you will have sounds without meaning. And basically, we flash in colors to tell you these areas operate together. They in synchrony. And you can see that it's only the auditory areas that become coupled to the sounds, but because the sound doesn't convey meaning, there is nothing else. Now, we can take the words of the story, and we can scramble it, and then we will have a list of words.
An animal, started facts, and right on Pie Man, essentially my story.
And basically, you can see that if you add language, you start to have alignment in early language areas. And if I'm taking this word and build sentences, basically now you can...
And they recommend against crossing that line. It says, "Dear Jim, good story, nice details. Didn't she only know about him through me?"
So now that we have like more complex language, you can see that other language areas become similar across all people. But only when I'm really keeping the narrative and making the story coherent, you can see that all these networks become aligned. And these other areas that care about thoughts and meanings become aligned across all of you. Now you can understand what I'm saying. I don't know why I don't...
Did it go off?
I don't have power, so the battery is low. So if someone can come and check the power over there. Okay, so I will continue. So basically now that we can see that these other areas become aligned, when I'm telling you real-life stories, you can ask, so what's driving this alignment? And basically we see the following. It's okay? Yeah, thanks. Okay, so basically, we can see that these other areas that care about meaning become aligned when I'm having the same meaning. So how do we know it? We took a story in English and translated it into Russian, okay? And now you have very different grammatical and language-based system to say the exact same meaning. And what we see is that the responses in the brain of the English listeners and the Russian listeners become similar in these other areas, but not in the auditory cortex that processes the sounds, because the sounds are very different. But because the meaning is the same, these areas operate in the same way. That's very nice, because that tells you the we that we can communicate across all cultures, right? So far we talked only about what's happening in you as listeners, but what's happening in my brain now when I'm speaking to you. So now we looked on the brain of the speaker and the brain of the listeners, and what we did, we do the same. I'm trying to ask, how similar is your brain responses as listeners, but now to my brain responses as a speaker when I'm producing the language. And what we see an amazing thing. We see that basically the brain responses of the listeners become similar to the brain responses of the speaker. So in a way, you can think about it, what I'm trying to do now, I'm trying to make your brain responses similar to mine. And I know that it's difficult. First, I know I have an heavy accent. It's not easy to understand what I'm saying. Second, I come from a different culture and speaking to a different culture. But I know, and I really know it, okay? I know that if you get me now, your brain responses is similar to mine. And if you're totally confused or totally lost, your brain responses are very different than mine. Okay? So what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to make your brain similar to mine. So far, we talked about how these similarities across brain allow us to communicate with everyone we meet. And now let's talk about the other side, the we versus the out group. How can we be more similar to our group and different than another group? Okay? Because it's a bit more complicated than I was telling you. I'm trying to be directly coupled with your brains, but your brain comes with a knowledge. There is a filter between you and I that this is your cultural filters. When I'm saying a word, it might have a different meaning to you and I. So we did the following experiment to look at it. We took a story by J.D. Salinger. And this is a beautiful story that has double meaning. And the story is going as following. A husband lost track of his wife in a party. He returned home by himself, picked up the phone, calling his best friend, asking, "Did you see my wife?" Next to the best friend, there is a woman lying in bed. And Salinger is smart. He never tells you who is this woman, right? And you have two interpretations in your brain when you're listening to this story. And of course, the scientists will ruin the interpretations, will ruin the ambiguity. We told half of the people in the audience, let's say this half. The woman that's lying next to the best friend, this is the wife. She has an affair. Okay? To the other group over there, we told the opposite. We thought, this is not the wife. The wife is loyal. This husband is jealous and crazy all the time. This is the actual girlfriend of the best friend, and they want to go to bed because they are tired. Okay? Very different interpretation. Now, you're all listening to the exact same story. And I want this half of you now, when I'm playing you like 20 seconds of the story, think about the interpretation that the wife has an affair, and the other half, think about the other interpretation.
Did you happen to notice when Joni was leaving? Did you happen to notice if she left with the Ellenbogans, by any chance? The gray-haired man looked left again, but high this time, away from the girl, who was now watching him rather like a young, blue-eyed Irish policeman. No, I didn't, Arthur. Didn't she leave with you? No, Christ. You didn't see her leave at all, then? Well, no. As a matter of fact, I didn't, Arthur.
Okay, so now let's think about the similarities and differences between the two groups. If I'm asking all of you now as an audience, why do you think the husband is feeling lonely when he's calling? You will all say, of course, he's feeling lonely because he lost his wife. He doesn't know what's happening, right? So you all understand it. Irrespective of the context, right? It's not that you're completely different. But if I'm asking you, why does the friend doesn't want Arthur to come over? Half of you will say, of course, he doesn't want to be caught. And the other will say, no, he's simply tired. What do you want from the poor guy? So now you can see that this one sentence that I gave you before the story started makes you different interpretation. Some of you think that the friend is lying. Some of you think the husband is crazy. And that's going to change your brains. So basically what we see that this like one sentence was enough to make your brain responses more similar to people that think like you and more different than the other group. So basically, if I'm looking in your brain in this experiment, and you know, chance level to guess what you're thinking is 50%, I can know, if I'm looking in these brain areas that care about the meaning, by 85%, what do you believe? I can know whether you think the wife has an affair or the husband is crazy, only by looking how similar you are to your group, to other people that think like you. And this is very strange, because it's meaning that if you think alike, in these very subtle ways, these brain areas become similar, more similar to your group than a different group, right? Okay, So now think about it. It was an arbitrary assignment, right? I can make all of this group believe that Azmet is crazy, but I choose to make your group believe that the wife has an affair, right? So in a way, both of you can be in its group, right? So now, how do you determine the truth now? Okay, so now it's getting also tricky. You know, it was an arbitrary assignment. I told you the wife has an affair, but maybe this is not the case. So you can see the knowledge that you gain from the outside going to change your brain responses, right? But what's happening now when we're getting to a more complicated situation, right? Instead of taking this wife affair, what if I'm asking you these questions? Is immigration good for the economy or not good for the economy, right? Immediately you can see that from where you're getting the resources, you're going to change your brain responses, right? So now you can see that it's really important to ask from where do you gain your resources, right? And now you can ask, okay, so what's happening? What's determining who group I'm similar more to, right? So first is the people you are connected to. And this is exactly the we that we're talking about. This we can determine by the people you are connected. And if you're connected to a different group of people, you're going to have a different filters on reality. And it's also determined by the media channels that you consume. If one sentence before a story started was enough to make you similar to your group, think what's happening if you listening for day after day after day to the New York Times or Fox News. You're going to have a very different model on reality. You're going to have a very different filter. And we see it over and over that these people have a very different meaning in their brain because they have a very different filters that make them all cluster together. And what we see in the society now, and I think this is something really scary, we see that this in-group, out-group, we see that there is like a divide between them, right? We see that it's extending. And I think what we see is that there are some forces in society that gain from increasing this divide across groups. And it's not only that there are some groups that gain power from it, there are also some meaning terms and ideologies that can amplify this difference, right? And you can see it over and over that there are some ideas in our society that will tend to push us away, further away from each other. And there are also some other ideas that can bring us together and basically relax these divisions, right? So there are ideas in society that can bring us more together. And now there are forces that at play, right? So in a way, it's not enough to say that I am because we are. We also need to decide about the ideas that will connect us or divide us. There's always going to be a division between we and other. That's part of our human being. This in-group, out-group is a good thing because it allows to think in different ways. We don't want everyone to think in the same way, right? But on the other hand, also there are forces that can push us even further away and then try to suppress the other. And that's what we want to avoid. So how can we do it? So now as a scientist, I think there is one thing that for me is really important. We have to establish a common ground. And I think the most scary thing that comes in our society is this idea of there is alternative facts. Everything is okay to say, okay? There is no objectivity. There is no search about the truth anymore. I think as a scientist, we have to say no. There are things that are okay to say. There are things that is not okay to say. And now going back to Michael yesterday, I'm saying, I don't want to have a coffee with Donald Trump because he's projecting values that try to separate society from each other, try to break the diversity. We don't want to go back there. There are things that you don't want to say. And now, we need to decide about the values that we want to take, right? And that's going out of Ubuntu to another society's form. We need to decide about the rules that will drive us together. So, you know, thinking about the French Revolution, they came with 3 values, right? Liberty, equality, and fraternity. And you can think about the 20th century as playing with these terms. You know, you amplify liberty, you can get capitalism. You can amplify equality, you can get socialism or communism, right? You amplify fraternity, you can get nationalism, right? So basically you can see that it's not easy to develop these terms, and there is dynamic over it and play as a society. But we need to decide about the rules. We need to decide about ways to talk about what is the ground truth. We cannot say all values are equal. There are things that we need to go and work as a society together. And we have to do it while preserving the differences across people. So we have to remember that we are all the same and we are all different. And there is something good about being similar to other people, and there is something good about being different. And we want to find this balance. And going back to Michael's talk yesterday, I think his sentence, "I am because you are," is a good sentence, right? Because the you accept that I am unique, and you are unique, but we are all connected. So that might be one way to make us all together. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yuri. Interesting to see the connections with Becca's talk, but also looking at some of the discussions that we were having yesterday. So, team, questions, clarification. Whoa, everybody's jumping in. Okay, so let's start with Mandaza, then we'll go to Becca, then we'll come to Mike.
Brother, thank you so much for a beautiful presentation. I love that presentation. It has brought some light to our hearts and to our people.
Thank you. Thank you.
I am because you are. There is a little bit of a danger there. I am because you are. We need to study that very closely too, wherever it is being used by our African people, foreigners, you name it. Because you cannot be Mandaza, who is a criminal. Mandaza is a lawbreaker. How can he become me because I am? We have to be careful on how we use that expression. It's like in the Lord's Prayer, they say, "Forgive us as we forgive others." There is no truth there. When we forgive others, and yet we have got conflict in the hearts of human beings. But we pray to say, "Forgive us as we forgive others." We need to go deeper into that. Do we understand the Lord's Prayer? Do we understand the meaning of this Ubuntu thing? Or you are because I am? Okay. It is when you came in beautifully, when we were talking about the we, very embodying, very uniting. That's one of the strongest areas of Ubuntu. Healing, proper. Peacemaking, proper. But these things we've known for ages now. What I seem to see is that what is left now for humanity is to put Ubuntu into practice, into reality. It must be very operational within us, yes, so that we become the we together, not excluding the skies. In the word together and the we, because we cannot live without the skies. There are gifts up in the skies. There are gifts in the waters of the world. There are also gifts in the land. So we need to bring that together the way you have been talking about. It's just beautiful.
Yeah,
I just wanted to add, that comment there. Transformation, recreating the self.
Yeah. Follow up.
It's when we talk of recreating the self, scientifically, we are talking of demolishing the boundaries that separate humanity from humanity. The boundaries that separate man from creation. Once we demolish that, we begin to see myself in those people there.
Exactly.
They no longer become those people, they become me. And when they look at me, they see themselves in me. Then we can talk of the we together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Papa.
Just a follow-up. Papa Mandaza, I think I am because you are is exactly the basis for that I am because you are.
All right.
Is that every encounter is a recreation of the self.
Exactly.
So the I am because you are does not isolate the we. You have to be a strong subject to offer something to somebody.
Yes.
If you are empty, you don't give somebody anything. It doesn't deny the existence of the we or the subject. It doesn't say the subject, the individual, must evaporate. So the basis here does not isolate that others exist, but that even the animal, the ancestors are part of it, so that you, the ancestors, is also part of my humanity. So when he says, what I understand him, I am because you are, is an extension that moves beyond that boundaries that separate us to incorporate plants, animals, everybody, strangeness.
Thank you.
Not just the good ones, but also the ones we don't even like, their faces, the way they look, their color, the vulnerability. And that is what it means that an Ubuntu character is a noble character.
Yes.
It's nobility of character.
Yes.
That is, those people are also part of my humanity. You know, African proverb says that even if your brother is a criminal, he's still your brother, because you don't know the day he's going to be the one to save you and your family. So we don't throw away a child because he's been bad outside. We still try to accommodate him. He's one of us still. And so that is the question that I am because you are, environment, everybody is part of it, but not just those we recognize as that look like us, but those who are also not part of us. And this is why Becky's talk, I think, is important, because we can also learn to move beyond our comfort zone to recognize the non-hooded rat as also part of it that enriches our humanity. Otherwise, we become like what the philosophers called monad, Leibniz. We put in a cup, and then we all throw each other, we mirror each other, and we raise our hand. We are powerful. But because we are inside the cup, we don't have window for new energy, for new spirit, for self-creation. And there's no self-creation because we are only committing intellectual incest. We're just reproducing our old copies and not new humanities. Ubuntu says new humanity. So what I think is, I am because you are, recreation of, encounter is a recreation of, every encounter is a recreation of the self for a new humanity. So the new humanities, that is the point.
I'm so happy to hear this comment because science is coming in so powerfully to heal.
Yeah. So,
because we heal people who are not with us now. We go out to people who don't see what we do, like you say here. We approach the people who are not with us. We want to bring them into this basket. That's where proper healing comes in. And the scientists are doing it so well. I'm so happy.
Yeah,
So
keep doing it.
Let me respond and then come to that.
I think it's a wonderful discussion. I want to say the following. I think the sentence, I am because we are. Okay, we're sitting in Africa, and we know that there is a lot of blood happening in Africa. So, there is a lot of wars between tribes and genocides that happen in Africa under this philosophy of Ubuntu. And I think what you are presenting, the healing perspective, and this is also connected to the Dalai Lama and the Buddhism, there is a perspective of, think about the we as a human nature and try to enhance compassion and practices to reduce this tension. So I think in reality, in politics, I don't think the human being is really practicing Ubuntu in the way you want to heal. And I think what's important in the way you practice is you give the human being a way to think about to change the dynamic, to accept that the other is different, but it's still equal, right? So now, this is exactly what I'm saying. There are ideas that can try to, not try to make everyone the same. You want to keep diversity in society, but you want to accept all sides. And there are forces in human nature that will try to say, I am, and I'm better than you, and I'm going to suppress you. Okay. And we see it coming up again in society again, and I think we need to fight it. We should not say all ideas are equal, okay? White supremacy is not fine, okay? It's not fine.
Yes.
And we're not going to have coffee with Donald Trump because if this is what is representing, is not my president. We need to say it. Otherwise, we will lose the ability to preserve this very delicate connection across people. And we know that this connection can break up. And 70 years ago, 100 million people died in 4 years because this dynamic break. So everything is fragile. It's a battle we are playing. It's a dynamical system. And I like your perspective of trying to change the dynamic, but we will change the dynamic only if we understand that there are forces that are also operating against it. And there is a fight over here. And this is why I was thinking, social structures and social ideas can promote society together. So we need to be clear about how we want this fragile connectivity to establish across people.
Everybody's dying to jump in, so I'm going to Becca and then to Carsten.
Okay, so this is, I guess, can sort of dovetail onto this idea of how do we change this? And I was thinking about your data where you just gave these people one little thing to think about, and that was enough to sort of cause coupling in one group and coupling in another group. And I'm curious how long-lasting something like that is. If you brought those people a month later, would they be able to recognize the people who, even on some very, very subconscious level, the people who had essentially been assigned the same perspective? Can you apply that in the real world, that sort of understanding of the way people kind of link up?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. First, I will comment. I was so surprised that one sentence, the wife have an affair, one sentence was enough to make your brain similar and different than the other group. So think about it, how easy it is to cluster together. It's really human nature. And now I'm thinking, if one sentence is enough, what's happening that you listen to Fox News for your entire life? This is where you get your information. It's way more than one sentence. And now we see that the statistics of meaning is very different. We do this study in the lab now, and we see that if I'm saying the word freedom, not many of you thinking about the word gun going in association with freedom. But some other people, I say the word freedom, they think about guns. That's a very different models that they're having in their mind because they are connected together to this medium. And how can you break this and start to have a dialogue between the groups? Because you have to have dialogues. Otherwise, it will not work. This is why this dialogue is so important. It's very difficult to do. And I, of course, I don't have the solution for it, but I can see the problem over it.
Carsten? And then...
Uri, thank you. I'm not sure I can express this well, so let me try. It seems to me that when you see this distinction emerging between, say, in-group and out-group, is it, and partly also the extrapolation towards, being confronted with Fox News or with the New York Times. To some extent, it all is stuff that is related to, I would say, solutions to basic problems that people have. So I want to have a nice life. I see that which is safe. I want to raise my children to become happy and good citizens. And now I am deprived of that for some reason, economic hardship. And now I turn to solutions. How can I solve this? How can I solve these deprivations on very basic needs? And on the solutions, we get filters. Some solutions become viable, getting a gun, shoot other people. And some solutions become out of my vision, out of my thought. Picking up the phone and talk to people or apply for a job or whatever. And my question, I think, is that the coupling of brains may be much more widespread and less distinguishing between in-group and out-groups when it is about very basic needs that are almost universal. Hunger, survival, be happy, having friends, love. Those things are so recognizable, I would say. There is no ambiguity there. There is no filtering there. The filtering is at the level of the solutions, how to achieve those things. And there you can create, but then it's a secondary level where we see in-group, out-group, and clustering of brains. What do you think?
I think the reason that we are similar is because we're living in the same world that makes us similar. How come I can talk with people in Africa when this is my first time visiting Africa? How come? And I can talk with people in Africa because, there is family structures in Africa. People go to work in Africa. People get sick in Africa. People get afraid. So you're right that there are like commonalities across all of us that make us similar. And that was the first part of the talk, that, I take Russian and English people, and they will be similar in their brain responses because we are all similar as human beings. And the way you should think about these differences, that on top of these similarities, there is a small wave that makes us slightly more similar to my group, okay? That the people, and this is why I was saying that all of you understood the story in the same way. You know why the husband is feeling lonely, right? You knew it. But on top of it, you was thinking, he's crazy, right? So it was like, on top of it, there was like a slight similarity in your group. And this slight similarity is enough also to cluster you even further. So it's not that the two groups have completely different responses. It was very, very similar. If you want to be technical, correlation of 0.5. But on top of it, there was like slight correlation of 0.1 that was enough to detect and understand. So it's a continuum. We are all similar, but we are a bit more similar to our group. And this bit more similarities can make a difference, right?
No, it makes a big difference. What I'm trying to figure out whether this is true or not.
That's the data.
Or, is because you basically create an ambiguous story. And then, so there's an ambiguity. So people are sort of like, okay, and then you give them a cue. You give them a possible solution to solve, but then to solve the problem that you have created.
Yeah.
And that problem is solved differently in this group than that group. And that then creates this distinction in the brain coupling.
Yeah.
And my hunch is, but really I think we should think more about it perhaps, is that the way groups organize is perhaps more in terms of the type of solutions that they see for creating or bringing further basic needs, rather than in those basic needs that they have.
Yeah. Yes, but is it?
And that's what I'm trying to figure out, whether you can even see that at the level of brain.
And I think we're in agreement because, first I think there is more ambiguity than you think. When Donald Trump gave a speech, you should understand that many people get it in a different way than you, okay? So the ambiguity lies everywhere, okay? If you look on the polls and you think that, if you're reading the New York Times, you saw that all of the people in the United States against Donald Trump. But when election will come and will be elected again, you might be surprised, okay? Because there are different models running in different people's brains. So ambiguity is always part of communication, right? And then the dynamic of it you're right. You can think of, I'm in a bad situation. I'm going to take a gun. I'm going to create a more structural infrastructure with social support for the weak. That's very different solutions to the same problem, right? So now how do you decide between taking a gun or building a social structure to help the poor? That's a social discussion across the people, right? So we need to decide about the social mechanism of solving problems, and not always are the same. One way we lead to one situation, and the other will lead to a very different. So.
Okay, Michael, you wanted to follow up, and then we'll go to Jim. You've got it. Okay.
Time's almost up, but I think there is a consensus here that a sort of a helpful way of thinking about Ubuntu is not leveling out the differences while retaining the differences of individuals and groups. At the same time, you also recognize the other as part of your own self-creation. So I think that is. And the other thing, that consensus that is emerging, or at least agreement that is emerging, is that part of that process has to involve getting to the common ground, the shared experience. And this is, basically what His Holiness means when he talks about oneness of humanity, trying to reach to the basic human level. So my question has more to do with how do we bring it out, okay? Exactly. Because in a sense, we're trying to motivate people to change. Now, there are two ways to do, maybe others, but I can see two ways. One is a self-interest motive. If you look at the way in which new social and cultural phenomena have been adopted, it has been adopted because people find personal benefits in it, whether it's mindfulness or yoga or whatever it is. So there's no coercion. Self-interest drives you. You want to be healthy, happy, and so on. You adopt it. That's one way. The other way is it's a bit more coercive, but built into the whole fabric of the society and institution. The concept of human rights I brought up yesterday. Because it has been embodied and formalized, institutionalized in the basic structure of the governance, everybody expects to be treated that way. And everybody is expected to respect that when dealing with others. So the question I have is, again, the same question. What is the best way, with relation to concepts like Ubuntu and recognition of the oneness of humanity and, tapping into the more compassionate impulse? Because I really agree with you that we shouldn't be naive. There are those two forces. And, in fact, the empathetic impulse that we are given, the nurturing expression that comes out of it, is also the same, I would argue, the same impulse that leads to tribalism. So it's a sort of what connects us is also what divides us. Yeah. So those two, being aware of those two forces is a crucial point so that we are not seen as naively promoting a kind of a beautiful world where everybody is the same and kind of, there's no differences. So I think, I'm struggling to see what would it look like.
I think basically you went as always to the point of the issue. And I think this is what we have these dialogues for. Because if I knew the answer, I will immediately give it to you. Because that's the most important issue that we are facing now, in this moment, in this time. And I think all the purpose of this dialogue across cultures is to look together for a solution that will increase this positive dynamic across people and increase the tendency that we see now to divide and suppress the other because it's different. Make America great again, it's meaning that I don't want the other people to be great again. I'm only thinking about myself. So there is forces in both ways, and I wish I knew how to make this dynamic better. I don't. I'm only a scientist that observing what's happening in this situation, and to change them, I think we need all of us together. It's not the speaker or the audience, it's all of us together. And I think this is why we're coming to this meeting, this is why we're having these dialogues, to try to figure it together.
Thank you.
Lily?
Okay, thank you, Theo. I'm going to try and make this relevant to an earlier comment that was made, where I wanted to jump in and say that this whole presentation here connects really, in my view, with the bigger question that we have, in Africa about how we achieve a positive identity that we can use as a platform to engage positively with the rest of the world, because we're coming from an era where we had learned to look down upon ourselves, to undermine ourselves because of the education system and all the experiences we had during colonization. And we're still really only emerging from that. It's still very much a part of what we are dealing with on a daily basis. And in that respect, it would appear to me that the education system has a great role to play, really, in helping us to continue the dialogue in scholarship in terms of really trying to tap into the past that we have ourselves suppressed because we brought on a higher platform the histories of other places, of our colonial masters. So in that scenario, the UNESCO came up with a project which is called the General History of Africa. The project was intended to help African nations and African leaders to come out of colonization in a manner that would really project a positive image to the world, in a manner that would help them to what shall I say, to bring together their various groups in their countries, the ethnic groups that had been disintegrated during colonization, to achieve nationhood. And nationhood is still very much a process, even today. But in there, we also have challenges of the fact that while we are trying to achieve nationhood, we find that sometimes we inadvertently suppress ethnic identities. And yet, in order to achieve nationhood, the nation has to be above the ethnic group. So it's a continuous dialogue, it's a continuous process of trying to balance things out so that in the end, we realize, now we have the African Union, we realize as African nations working through the African Union, we have to achieve a certain unity that goes beyond what's in the policy documents. And how do we do that? This project of UNESCO, called the General History of Africa, ought to be taught. It's in 8 volumes. Probably there will be a 9th volume coming out soon, but it's not widely known, so it's not widely used. And it is something that really has great potential for helping us to achieve African integration and true African Union, because we would understand who we are as Africans, our cultures, our languages, and also understand that we are diverse, but that diversity doesn't mean that we must go at each other's throats and kill each other, but that we can use this diversity in very positive ways in order to be able to face the world as a united front. And that would also help us in, issues of economic partnerships that we might achieve with other nations, because we'll be facing them as a united front. But where does it come from, this unity? It comes from knowing who we are. Yes. And who we are doesn't necessarily mean that we look at the others as enemies, because we need each other. I was just saying about partnerships with others. So we do this in a sense that would also help us to contribute to this oneness of humanity. So in a sense, teaching African history in schools does not necessarily mean we must not know about other people. So it's not an exclusive curriculum, but it's a curriculum that starts with us. Yes. And then when we know about us, then we're more, powerful, and we have the strength, and we have the capability, and we have the room, this space that we can create to bring others in. And then we continue on like that. So really, I just thought I would just park this there in front of us, so we know.
And Michael wanted to add
this kind
quickly to that.
Interactions.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a very good. I'm also a historian, so I could connect with you. And the problem for me is not that we have ethnicities. We know that ethnicity, at least in indigenous Africa, is very fluid and dynamic. People can move in and out of different ethnicities. So you go to Johannesburg, you see a kid, he speaks Shona, Ndebele, Zulu, you see Zulu, 7 languages, moving in and out of different languages. It doesn't say I'm particularly Shona or whatever. But colonialism came, of course, and tribalized it. So when the ethnicity became politicized, then we have a tribe. And so we move away from ethnicity to the tribe. And the tribe is what we inherited and we assume as a condition we have today. But ethnicity, which every member of a community is part of an ethnic group, which is wonderful, is part of your culture and identity. The question is then, when we move from ethnicity to tribalism, when that ethnicity becomes politicized as a minutest local political unit, then it's no longer dynamic, it's no longer creative, it becomes rigidified. And I am Swana, anybody who doesn't speak Swana is a Makwere, becomes a politicized group, and that is the danger we have. So having our ethnicity in the background is wonderful, and there's something that we need to talk about and debate and tell our people, it's okay to be Shona, but that is not the only person you are, because before colonialism, you could be Shona, you didn't say, I am Shona. Because Abuya Nehanda didn't fight for Shona, he fight for everybody in that great Zimbabwe. He was fighting for everybody. Abuya Nehanda, when he was fighting, he didn't say, okay, Ndebele. People spoke different languages and stuff, and everybody were included in that ethnic dynamic group. So we move away from that tribe, which is politicizing our ethnic identity, to become a political unit. This is what professors like Mamdani, Hobsbawm Rangers, they've talked about this in their own work and stuff like that. And my reaction then is to you. Okay, when you said the boundaries, what the basic need, and I'm wondering, isn't it true that sometimes it's not basic need that stimulates that kind of coupling and grouping? Sometimes, some demagogue, to feel good, they don't have any basic need, they're happy in their office, they're wonderful, they're living good. It's like the argument that poverty is a cause of terror. But then the people who started terrorism, most of them went to Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge. They are well educated. They are rich family from very wealthy families. They're not even poor, And then, so it's no longer about basic need, but some other ideological principles. So can we move away from basic need? Because apart from that bottom-up problem, there's also the ideological.
I'll give you the very quick answer.
Okay.
If I say, I think I want to have a certain status in my group. I think you can relate to that. Maybe it's not so important for you to have a certain status within your group, but you can understand, you see that. It's a basic thing that everybody wants to have a certain status in their group. I want to feel and be loved. And one way to feel and be loved is perhaps by saying we need their territory.
Is one way.
That's one way, but that's a solution. That's a solution that is a means to achieve a basic need, that is to be loved. There are other ways to be loved by the people around you. There are other ways to be loving for them, for example. You get love back. That's another solution. But the basic need is in both cases there. And their basic need is not any different when I say, let's go and aggress them and see how loyal and heroic I am, and therefore I'm loved, because that's the ultimate thing that I want. And I choose a certain strategy. And you may not at all relate to that strategy. You may say, that's stupid, that's awful, that's immoral. But when I say, but I did it because I want to be loved, you can say, well, that I understand. But what I do not understand is the strategy that you pursued. And that's where I think the boundaries are.
So the context.
That's where the misunderstandings, and that's where the spite oftentimes is. The spite is not that they deny you to be loved. The spite is about the fact that you chose to aggress. And that is where I get angry.
But that's contextual now, which cannot be universalized. It becomes the context of history becomes significant, because what mediates that kind of attitude, for him, is nature, environment. That's where he gets his status. Not from he likes to relate with people and nature and everything, even other animals. So then the context is what defines that, and that cannot then. So maybe you say, my experience in Netherlands, if I approach it to Africa, will be completely different.
We'll talk.
Okay.
Okay, so Uri, did you have anything that you wanted to say in response, given?
No, I don't think I said everything.
You think, okay. So what I actually was going to do now, but I'm getting conflicting signals, was actually to give people literally, and I'm very strict on this, you don't want me to come and rugby tackle you in the audience, 5 minutes for burning questions. We will actually have a real question and answer session after the afternoon session, and we will have a specific additional interaction at 3:15. But this really was 5 minutes for any burning questions that people had, and I can see 1, 2, 3. If you speak for more than a minute, I will come and rugby tackle you. This is, are there any mics in the audience? Okay, this one's working. Okay, and can the next person go to that mic, please?
I'll take the risk of rugby tackle from you.
Okay.
My name is Pushpendra Jain. We know human body is a powerhouse of electrical activity. All the signals move through bioelectricity. If you prick your finger, you feel the pain, the brain feels the pain, the message goes through the bioelectricity. And wherever there is electricity, there has to be electric field, which is a long-range field. And electric fields interact with each other. So as I speak, my electric field, which we also call aura, is interacting with yours. Now, in what way can we use the interaction of this bioelectric field to inculcate Ubuntu and Ubuntu among humanity? Thank you.
Thank you. Now that's a question I like, and concise. So can we take the next 2 or 3, and then I'm handing it back upstairs.
Yeah, no, this is yours.
It's mine.
No.
Okay, so there's many things we don't know as scientists, and I don't want to talk about things that I don't know about. I saw that we are coupled, physically coupled, but it's like electromagnetic waves that going from my mouth to your ear. Now we are coupled. Now you're asking about other form of energy that might help us to be coupled. I know nothing about these energies. I cannot tell you as a scientist. I don't want to go across my field. I will leave it to your young generation to investigate and find this answer.
Okay, so now we have the 3 questions there, and then please ask them one after another. Then I'll hand it back to the panel, and then we'll wrap up.
So one of the things that His Holiness always tells us is that experience of stress, in fact, is necessary for acquiring resilience. And one of the things that science also has now shown us is that your response to stress can be inherited. And so I wonder if the neuroscientists could say something about the epigenetic consequences of transgenerational learning.
Okay, next.
I refer to the question Jinpala asked in the 2 days. How to establish thinking like Ubuntu in humankind. And I hope that maybe Mandasa or also the Vice Chancellor of this university can answer that we can learn from how African people here do establish Ubuntu in their youth, in their children. How do you teach them? How are your methods? This I would like to learn.
Thank you.
We haven't covered this one yet. Art and creative practice. Where is that in Ubuntu? And art and creative practice. And I have some answers, but I'd like to hear some answers from the panel. because I feel arts and creative practice has a very significant part to play in building Ubuntu culturally and globally.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to hand these questions back to the whole of the panel, and anyone can pick any question that you would like to respond to. The one thing that I wanted to say about some of the second question about practices is that we will be having some examples in the discussions tomorrow, which will hopefully answer some of those questions for you.
Okay. I can take the first question. So that question was about the concept of epigenetics, which for those of you who haven't heard that term before, it is the idea that the experiences you have can cause very, very tiny changes in the way your DNA is organized. And those changes can be passed on to your children. And those tiny changes can actually have effects in the way that you respond to stress and process, the events that happen to you. And so the example would be is if something happened to you and then you went on to have a child, the child might respond to a similar event in a specific way because of these epigenetic changes that happen to you. So in other words, these are things that are not learned, but that are transferred hereditarily, but it's not the specifics of the DNA itself. It's about the structure of the DNA. And so there is some evidence. This is still a really new phenomenon for neuroscientists. We knew that epigenetics existed for other areas of biology, but in neuroscience, this is still really new. And so we're still trying to understand the specifics of how these things work and how they can be manipulated. And so, it's interesting to think about that, the experiences you have can influence the way your children respond, but then they're going to have their own experiences that can then reorganize things again and then be passed on to their children. So it's a phenomenon that we know exists and that can influence the way you respond to threatening stimuli, but we haven't got it all figured out yet, but it's ongoing work.
Okay, would anyone else like to respond to any of the other questions in the next?
Thank you.
Lily.
The question about how we teach our youth Botho. Let me say that it's actually quite a challenge. We have to start right there, acknowledging that there's a huge challenge because we're trying to teach something of what we used to have plenty of, but which in practical demonstration we no longer have so much of. But nonetheless, maybe in our minds and in our recollections of our experiences as young people, we have it in us. But because of the many influences that exist today, they create a lot of noise, in terms of what you may try to instill, either in your own household or maybe even in the wider environment, whether in the school system or anywhere else. And also, part of the problem is the power of the written word, the power of the written word over the spoken word. In this sense, I mean the fact that what young people read, and obviously also with the availability of the relevant types of media that expose them to different kinds of things, tends to carry more weight than what you might say to them by word of mouth, trying to apply that social sanction or trying to discourage them by saying that's not how we do things in our culture, and so on and so forth. And so it goes back to the school system. To what extent is it actually helping, particularly in terms of the material that may be used within the classes and in the courses that students are exposed to? That reading material is still very much absent, which would be relevant to studying or teaching our young people about our past, which for us is the basis for then moving forward and saying, so because then we would be understanding who we are, so how can we then engage with other people? So, and to bring it down to a practical level, let me say that even when we were growing up, it's not like everything was cut and dry, like you know exactly what to do all the time. It was all open to constantly being reminded by adults about what is right, what is wrong, how to approach this and how to approach that. And I can just quickly give an example of that. When I was growing up in the extended family that we held in high regard, there was a grandpa who was known for really being able to confuse you as a young person. So depending on his mood, he would have insisted on you responding to what he said, because otherwise you didn't respond, you didn't talk back. You didn't talk back to adults. There's a lot of that talking back now. You didn't talk back, so he would say, don't talk back, don't talk back. So you'd keep quiet. And then other days he would probably be needing a response from you. So you are quiet because you know you're not supposed to talk back. They say, answer me, answer me. So you see, even then there were challenges, but there are even more challenges now because of the challenges we have in the wider environment. But we try, mainly through social sanction, but also through encouraging dialogue amongst youth in the ways in which they would find it more amenable to what they like to do. Like, media, maybe we should be tapping more into that.
So we will come back to these other questions because we will have more time. The arts and the creative arts question actually links very much to what Lily was saying. We all know arts, music, culture are at the heart of African tradition and actually very much reflect and engage many of our rituals and are moving forward. We can talk about a lot of that as we go ahead in the next day and a half of dialogue. But I would like to keep us to time so that you can have lunch and be back here at exactly 1 o'clock so we can kick off again. But I'd like us to end by just saying thank you so much to Becca and to Uri for some great presentations. And thank you very much, wherever you're sitting. I can't see you now, Sechabo, for starting us off this morning with the sun clapping. Thank you, everybody. Lunchtime, 1 o'clock.